Okay, so now we're going to talk about the problem of trust from the point of view of governments, banks, and businesses. And first, for a state, for a government, inflation comes in when you have expenses that are larger than the national budget, which comes from your revenue. You have a deficit when your expenses are more than your revenue, and it's to pay for this deficit is where inflation comes in. So that the government has to create new debt, and for the U.S. This is the U.S. Treasury, the U.S. Treasury bills, and although the Federal Reserve does get some of these bills as assets, they're sold all over the world to banks, to people, individuals all over the world are going to buy these U.S. Treasury bills. And what a treasury bill is, it's a promissory note. It's a note that it's a promise from the government of the United States that, hey, if you give me $100 now, I'm going to give you $104 or 103, 105 at some interest rate. I'm going to give you more money at some point in time in the future, and that's how our deficit is funded. But the problem lies is come that future date, from the U.S. point of view, we now have a little bit larger in our deficit that has to get funded. And this item here on the expenses, interest on debt, is going to go up. So assuming no change on spending habits, which is a pretty safe assumption if you look at this chart for a second. So what this leads to is a debt spiral, because initially the debt, the deficit, the interest on the debt to cover the deficit is small, but every period is going to compound. And this is showing the U.S. debt, and you can see this, the compounding effect continues to increase exponentially. And this same concept applies to almost all nation states. And once you reach a certain level of debt, there's really no good options you have to get out of it. I mean, you could number two here, drastically change your spending habits. That doesn't sound like a politically good thing to do. Default on the debt, likewise. So really, your only viable option is just to continue playing the game. I mean, you're down a one-way street. You have to issue more debt, pay more expenses on the interest, and you just continue down this street. You continue to amplify the problem. That's the government's only option. And if you look at it from the banking point of view, this is our example a couple of sections ago on how inflation impacts banks. So we talked about if asset prices go significantly down, say due to overspeculation, then because of that drop in prices, the bank is operating at a loss. It's gonna put their financial position it's gonna put their finances in a very shaky position. And that can create distrust in the bank. And then over here on the right side, everyone's going to get nervous, run to the bank, trying to get all their money out of it. But because of fractional reserve banking, there's only a small amount of money available, based on only a small amount of real money available to back the deposits, which was a significant problem that was solved with these government commitments that no matter what, we're gonna guarantee this money. We're gonna make more. We're gonna issue debt, make more money if you need to. It's related to the terms too big to fail. We're gonna bail out these banks. The government's in this position where they've already made this commitment. They have to support the banks in these situations. And the situations that do happen, the too big to fail situations, the government creates more money, and this further just exacerbates the problem of for the deficit and the debt and the interest to be paid on that debt. And then from the bank point of view, if you look at from a bank with bank here on the left has no fractional reserve. It's got 20 units of assets and 20 units of liabilities. But you compare this to the bank on the right, it's got fractional reserve. It is basically expanding its business just by accepting more risk on not even their assets. They're accepting more risk on their customer deposits. And they don't even have skin in the game. And not only is the risk not tied to their money, on top of that, the government has said, we're going to insure all these deposits for you. We're going to keep you safe. so it's fractional reserve is it's just free additional business with very little risk. And if you're a non-fractional reserve bank, it just makes zero sense. You have to increase fractional reserve just to compete with the banks that are going to do it. All you need is one bank to say, yep, I'm doing fractional reserve. Then all the rest have to compete with them. And really the overall incentive is all the banks just continue to push the boundaries on fractional reserve. And that's where their incentives are lined up. And then this decreases the financial health of the bank, which just further compounds the problem, or increases the chances of a bank run, increasing the fragility of the banking system, putting the government more and more on the hook for too big to fail or bailout type situations. And again, all this ties back to increased deficit spending, and it's just another factor that compounds inflation. And politically, and this is a tweet from Donald Trump, but this is not a Republican or Democrat thing. This is universal for both parties. Politically, governments want to increase inflation, and Trump's tweet points out why. So he is making the statement, I want to increase the quantity of US dollars, because this is going to weaken the dollar, increase inflation. Our products are going to become cheaper in other countries that have less inflation than us. And this is good for our jobs. So this is good for politicians because they can take something very tangible, and this is good job creation, and they can display this to their constituents. And the cost of them doing this is inflation, which is largely hidden from most of the public. So it's it's seemingly a free lunch for politicians. And then we also have these other incentives to hide inflation. For starters, inflation exists because of government overspending. So that's not a great not a great selling point for politicians. And also politically, inflation negatively impacts a large swath of the population. Generally individuals that are not financially literate, and also their labor and their knowledge skills are not very specialized. They're not in high demand, and it also impacts wealth and equality between these classes and the upper class. We'll talk more on that later. So politicians don't want this large swath of the population to understand inflation. And there's also misinformation that persists. So this statement here, the cause of inflation varies, and this article here, it's workers demanding higher wages that's driving prices up. It's a lot of misinformation. But these might be those two examples we just went through. They might be causes of very short-term inflation, very, very short-term. But if you look over 10, 20, 30 years, there's only one driver of inflation, and that is government increasing the quantity of money. The value of the money goes down, you need to spend more of it, the prices are going to go up. That is the main driver of inflation over time. Money supply increasing beyond the supply-demand equilibrium. And this is what drives inflation. You got to look over a long time period. And also we covered earlier, there are several mechanisms that in effect, they are underreporting inflation. We talked about the hedonic quality adjustments. We talked about certain items getting priced out of the basket. And there's an organization called Shadow Stats. They very meticulously track what they think the real measure of inflation is. And you can see it's like 5 to 10% higher. And why? And so why would the government underreport? Well, there's a very large incentive to do so. So every year, government benefits, retirement, healthcare, and other benefits, they are increased to account for inflation. So if inflation is underreported, that's just you're shortchanging those benefits. You don't have to increase them as much. So it's a way to save money, spend money on other programs, and you can do this in such a way where largely it stays hidden from public view. And also companies mask inflation as well, though not necessarily for nefarious incentives. And companies plan for this in their product timelines. If you have a product that's going to last 10, 20, 100 years, companies know prices are going to rise, and they account for this. The cost going into the product, they know is going to increase over time. the price of their product is going to rise in the marketplace. So they have strategies to account for this, and this goes into the product design and product evolution. So different quantities of containers or different concentrations. So these on the surface they're going to look the same. And for cereal, I see this all the time. There's just never-ending stream of different size labels of cereal, and really all this is doing is just always disguising the effects of inflation. And this is not necessarily nefarious against the consumer. They don't want you to show up one day and their product is 20% more expensive than the competitors. Then they might lose you. You might switch to your competitors. And now back to the can of Campbell's tomato soup. This is why this is a great proxy for inflation. Because over a long time span, there's no way to dilute or play any trickery with this just a single serving of tomato soup. And then for companies, also when it comes to centralized efforts to control the money, keep the amount of money steady, this really doesn't, and that's the fiat inflation or inflation and central control, which needs a large amount of inflation for central control. One of the benefits is this: companies don't even necessarily need this. So if you look from a company point of view, a company to move forward is going to look at different business options, different projects, and any swings in the quantity of money, as long as it's not like a gigantic swing of money, are all going to impact their options in the same way. They measure impacts from net present value of the project, IRR, payback period, a number of ways. But if there's swings or natural fluxes in the supply of money, it's going to impact all their options the same way. So it's not really a factor when it comes to their decision. And kind of the reverse of that, the inflation and central control of money is actually more problematic for companies because the amount of money is much more unpredictable because it's based on votes from this 12-member committee. And this 12-member committee just has an easy capability to inject large amounts of money into the system, which historically has just created booms and busts that are bigger. And companies have to build their finances on top of this foundation, and this foundation is inherently unstable and prone to larger booms and busts. So in conclusion, once you start an inflationary practice, even 100 years later, so for the U.S., inflation started 100 years ago with the U.S. Federal Reserve. The president today, the Congress today, they have no viable option except to continue down the one-way street. And all the while, there are misaligned or perverse incentives all over the place to keep the effects of inflation disguised and hidden from the average person.